who trained your conscience? An idea for this actually came from when I was struggling for my second sermon idea this week. I moved off of the sermon thoughts and went to finishing the bulletin, so I'm glad I haven't passed that off yet to someone else who has offered to take it. But it gave me an idea for this one, because if you look at your bulletin articles today, it is about our conscience. And the author of the article discusses the idea that for our conscience to take shape and to take form, we must first be trained. And so we have to bring it up just like anything else. And so that's kind of the idea of where this came from. And it depends on what we feed our conscience as to how it is trained. So the idea for this morning's lesson comes from that thought process. So to get started, just looking at Proverbs 16, verse 25, says, "There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." Do we take, left to our own devices is not always the best thing for mankind and for each of us. We have to have something to help guide us. Even with the guidance, sometimes we slip and fall. We can even look back at the Garden of Eden, and we see where Eve and Adam were given guidance of, don't touch this tree right here, anything else you can have, and yet they still did not follow that. But looking at the idea of training our conscience and looking at the articles in the bulletin, I strongly recommend reading those, and will hopefully help meld all of this together a little bit better. But one idea to think about, and that's brought out in the bulletin, is the idea of Joseph and his 12 sons. And when they took and killed, Jacob and his sons, because when Joseph was the son who was told to his father that your son has died. His favorite son, he gave him the coat of many colors, and when he was coming out to the field, his brothers conspired against him. And so, not the point of the lesson of today, but when they took and they were going to kill him, but one of them had enough sense to say, no, that's wrong. So one of them's conscience was bothered by killing their brother, so they sold him to slavery, took his coat, dipped it in animal's blood, and gave it back to his father. Said, your son has died. Jacob now believed at that moment forward that his son was dead. He believed that with all the information that he had been given by what he had been able to absorb, and so he now lived his life as though his son was dead. We do the same thing to our consciences. In a manner of speaking, that is the illustration that the author used in the bulletin article, and I think is a good one because it helps lead into the idea, how do we train our conscience? How is it trained? First, it must be taught. Paul uses a reference of food, which on Fellowship Sunday, I definitely understand the idea of food. But we also understand this in our lives. If we look at Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 through 14 specifically, for when the time has come that you ought to be teachers, you have need to be taught again the first principles of the oracles of God, and are not become such as have the need of milk, and not of strong meat. For everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongs to them that are of full age, even those who by reason have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Paul uses this reference of being taught, of being able to grow. Our conscience must grow. It must take form. When we're a little baby, we don't know right from wrong. We don't know that what we have done is incorrect. Even when you're inside and you start kicking on mommy's bladder and making her have to go every 5 minutes, we don't know that that is impolite. We have to develop those senses, develop that idea of what we're to do. As we grow physically, the idea of going from milk into mushy foods, into solid foods, we are able to understand that by growth as a person, we are able to grow in what we can eat. The same is true for our spirit, for our conscience. And Christ says that we must be taught by God. In John 6:45, it says, "It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." Interesting that in this particular passage, he does not say taught of God, but taught by God. Now, they can be one and the same if we do that correctly, but we must be taught by God, and we do that through the Word that we have in our hands, through the Bible. And based off of that idea, being taught by God, the idea of what we are taught matters. It's interesting to look at the world around us. Look at what people view as their character of life. You know, what lifestyle do the people choose? What have you chosen in our lives? What do people outside choose in theirs? What do they choose to believe or think is okay? As we've been studying Wednesday night in worldliness, we see all sorts of different ideas of things that people consider right for them. But odd that it's not right for us to do that to them, even though they do it to others. You know, we're going to use the idea of stealing, that some people grow up thinking it's okay to steal because I'm taking from you, and since you have it, that's extra for you and something I need, so I can just do it. But yet they don't want that same logic applied to them. All of a sudden, their conscience is pricked. Wait a minute, you can't do that. Why not? You just did it to me. Yeah, but I can. You get into this vicious, weird cycle. But how is that person taught from the beginning? How easy is it to change our mind once we have learned something? I think back, when I was in orchestra class, we would take and be playing a song, and when the conductor heard that a couple of us made a mistake at a certain point, he said, "Stop. Let's go back to this verse, this bar, and let's play it again." And he would make us play it right multiple times before we could go back to the rest of the song. As part of our practice, do we take and realize when we make a mistake, stop and fix it? Once we learn an item, whether it's a mistake or good, we learn it. And it is hard to break that cycle, break out of that. And so that is why our orchestra instructor would agitate us sometimes, because he wouldn't let us get past these 4 bars of music over and over and over, because he wanted us to get it right. Not just play notes, but get it right. So we were trying to train and learn it right before we moved forward. Sometimes it's hard to get out of a situation, especially if we don't know that it's a bad situation. Look at some of the different things that involve the stealing of children or the inhumane acts that are done. They get them as children for a reason. Who is easier to train? Me or a little child? Who is easier to take and warp, corrupt? They want the younger the better, because then they can take and let them grow up in an environment that is unfriendly, but they don't know that it's unfriendly. It's easier to convince. A lot harder to convince an adult than a child sometimes. The child's mind is trying to absorb everything around, grow, learn. We should be more like that in ways, especially since Christ tells us to be as this child, innocent, wanting to learn, wanting to come. Hopefully we continue as we grow and develop to fine-tune our ideas and our thoughts so that we might be pleasing to God in the process. But what we are taught matters. Isaiah tells us to look to that which is above for what we need. God's ways are higher than our ways, and God recognizes this. He knows that it is not within us to have our own steps. He knows that we will need assistance, and he takes and requests that we look to him. Isaiah tries to illustrate this in Isaiah 55. verses 6 through 9. Seek ye the Lord while you may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Lest the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him. And to our God, for he is abundant in pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. Again, going back to the Proverbs, the idea that, it is not in us to guide our own steps. We are to take and look to God. We can also take a look, and we are taught to look to things above, not the worldly items here. Looking in Colossians, starting in pretty much almost that whole chapter, but we look there and see so many things. In Colossians, we have verses 1 and 2 says, If then you are raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth. And then he'll continue and tell us some of the things of the earth, but the idea is set our thoughts and our minds on those things which are above. What are our thoughts? What are we looking to in our daily lives? Do we look just inwardly to ourselves? Do we just look at our toes and our next step to make sure we don't trip on the sidewalk? Or do we look forward? Do we look above? How many times does looking down cause troubles? I can easily think of Jonah when he was told to go to Nineveh. Read through the passage and think through each time that he went down someplace. He went down to the ship. He went down inside the ship. He went down into the belly of the fish, down to the depths. Because he kept looking inward to himself, looking down, looking away from God. And by doing that, he went down, down, down. When he finally looked up, because his conscience and his spirit could no longer take it, he looked up where he should have been looking the whole time, to God, and then he came up from the depths. He came up out of the fish. He went up to Nineveh, and look at what happened to that city. The city of Nineveh is another, just looking at the people there, they were pricked in their hearts. How many times I didn't even think about that one in coming up with this lesson. Think about that phrase in the Bible. They were pricked in their hearts. Their conscience was pricked. It was awakened. There was something there that brought it out. But in order to do that, we must search the Scriptures for the complete information. And we do that through several means. We see it being in John 5:39, you search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and these are which testify of me. Christ was sitting there talking to those that were doubting and debating him and saying, you search the Scriptures, because he's teaching them things and telling them things, and they're trying to find a loophole or find where he's wrong because the Scriptures tell about the Christ that's coming. He says, I'm telling you what you need to know. I am here. What you're looking at is telling you to look up at me. Have we taught our conscience correctly and wisely so that we can see it? We can also look over it. I've got more scriptures there to look at, but look and see, what does the Bible say? So we know what we are taught matters. Do we want to send or go to school and learn wrong information? If I go to class and want to become something specific, I've got a teacher in the audience, I've got a student in the audience, we're all students in the audience as well. We're all to continue to learn every day. If I go to class and I expect my teacher to teach me what is correct from our books, from our subjects, so that way when I go out to do that thing, I will be able to do it successfully. I don't want to learn the wrong way to wire something as if it were the right way to do it, go out and blow up a factory. I think there would be bad consequences to that, and I wouldn't be able to work anymore if I was still there to talk about it. I don't want to build something that's going to take and harm someone else. I would like to be able to build it appropriately. So what we are taught matters. What do we feed ourselves? What information do we allow in to build our conscience, to build our sense of right and wrong, to do we follow God or not? With that thought comes the question, has our conscience been properly trained? It's been trained, but is it properly trained? Jesus gives his first public sermon. If you want to be, there are several examples found in the Sermon on the Mount. I usually end up going into Matthew for this, but it's in several of the Gospels. But looking through, if we were to review Matthew chapter 5, starting with, we would see where Jesus gives this information about the proper training needed for our conscience. He points out also how to verify that training. Not just has it been trained, but has it been trained appropriately. And in this idea, we outline in chapter 5 that Christ teaches us that we are to make sure that our internal training and we are internally focused. Is it just good enough to say something? Or do we also have to believe it? Do we have to live it or just be able to say it? We can read and memorize the Bible. There are people with photogenic memories. I would love to have that ability, but I don't. But I can, there are people that can look at these pages and memorize every word that's there and be able to turn around and go to a blank piece of paper and write it all out and give you an identical copy. Is that enough? Or do you have to understand what has been read, what is there and applied in our lives? And that is what Jesus takes issue with in a couple of these phrases and passages that I have outlined here. The first being, you have heard, but I say. Look for that variation in your, how the translators in your version have this, but look at that 6 times in chapter 5. Just chapter 5 alone, it gives us that. In verses 21, 27, 31, they're listed here on the piece of paper. They're listed on the outline, but each one of these, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. Each one of those, you have heard it was said, don't do this or do this physically. But I say, internally, spiritually, make this your lifestyle. In any one of these, starting 21 is, you have heard it was said, thou shalt not kill. But I say that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said in times of old, do not commit adultery. But I say, whoever looketh on a woman with lust in their heart is committed already. It has been said, whoever shall put away his wife. But I say that if you shall put away, saving for the cause of fornication. Again, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, you have heard that it was said, like a checklist of things, yes or no. But I say, do these things in your heart. Not the bad things that I'm saying you have heard, don't do this. Don't do these things in your heart. Let your conscience be strengthened. Let this be encouraged to you to be able to be better than a checklist. As we go forward to chapter 6, we see another phrase that comes out several times. Do not do like, but. Or do not be like. If we look at verse 2, it says, therefore, when you do your alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. They have their glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what the right hand does. Verse 5 is the next one. When you pray, thou shalt not be like the hypocrites are. But when you pray, enter the closet with thou hit there and shut the door. Pray to the Father which is in secret, and the Father which is in secret shall reward you openly. Verse 16 is another one of those. Moreover, when you fast, be not like the hypocrites. But when you do, wash yourself. Don't show a sadness about doing something. Very interesting that the religious leaders of the time were doing each of these things that Christ said, do not be like the hypocrites. Don't show off in front of everyone to do this. Rather do it from the inside. You know, as you do it outside and outwardly, there are certain times, especially for prayers, you know, in the worship assembly, we have a public prayer. You are doing it for the congregation. That is acceptable, but what these people were doing is trying to show how great they were, and their conscience was not bothered by that. They were showing themselves off instead of focusing themselves towards God. Christ is saying, let your conscience be properly trained to focus towards God. Let it come from the heart and from the soul. Why is it that so many people don't want to get up inside the assembly? They don't want to be about themselves, and that I respect. Sometimes we need a leader that is less about themselves and more about God. And that's in all aspects of life. That's with government, that's with business, that's with religion. With the idea that we have been trained, with the idea of having the proper training, what we have been taught, the next question has to come down to the idea of what will your conscience or my conscience allow us to do? If we are taught, if we are given that idea of having our consciences built up, as Christ has tried to build up in his first sermon and everything he has ever taught, what will we let our consciences allow us to do? Now, we stumble from time to time. We take and are not perfect. But does our conscience remind us of that fact when we do stumble? If we go out and tell someone a flat-faced lie, does it bother us that we just did that? If we steal from somebody, does it bother us that we just did that? Now, hopefully we're not doing those things, but just as an easy example of something that should make us think about it. First, our conscience should bother us before we do it to stop us from doing it. Why did I even think about that? Why did I even consider that? But if the thoughts come in, will we stop ourselves? Will we take and have remorse about it? That's the great part about our conscience too. If we do something that is wrong and it bothers us, that is good. We can fix it. We can take and ask forgiveness. We can make the recompense that needs to be made. If we stole something, we give it back and we give what needs to be given. If we lie about something, we go and we correct it. Maybe the lie wasn't intentional, but we find out that we did. We can fix it. That part's free. It's not on the outline. But what will we allow our conscience to do? Will it allow us to miss the gatherings of the church? As we look in Acts chapter 2 at the end there, once they believed, they continued daily in the teachings and in fellowship with those of like faith. They continued to gather together. Hebrews 10:25 talks about as the day approaches. Are we gathered together? Now, some equate that portion there to be looking at the destruction of Jerusalem, but looking at the general sense of it, those that are of the faith are gathered together. They gather together. They worship with each other. They edify each other. Do we do that? Or do we allow ourselves not to? How many more did we used to have in this auditorium that could still be here? Now, whether they're with us or with another congregation of the Lord's church, are they with a body to worship this day? Are we worshiping? Are we gathering? And not just at, worship service, not just Sunday morning service, Bible studies, Sunday evenings. What about Wednesdays? What about singing? What about the game night coming up? Chances of edification. As we are able, are we? And I'll put that word in there, that little phrase, as we are able. Because we're not always able to make every function, not able to do every task or everything. But are we able, and do we? Will it allow us to believe and follow misinformation? Now, sometimes we don't know. In the outline, I say misinformation like Saul, because think about the bulletin article. We talk about Jacob received misinformation, but he had no way to verify that. He was told animals got him, which means that it destroyed the body, it's been taken away. There's nothing to verify. So he lived several years believing his son was dead until they found out he was in Egypt when they came to try and get some grain, and he called his entire family to come. Imagine the tears of joy, the overwhelming sensations that Jacob would have felt when all of a sudden he saw his youngest son was not dead. Imagine also there may have been a little bit of frustration that showed up with his other sons that told him that lie for those many years. But looking at Saul in this case here, do we believe misinformation? Saul was taking and was staying strong in his faith as a Pharisee. He was staying strong with persecuting the church, and there are several verses here that are found, but the one that really stands out is 1 Timothy 1 and verse 12. 1 Timothy 1, 12 and 13 says, "And I thank Christ Jesus our Lord, who has enabled me, for that he has counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry, I was before a blasphemer, a persecutor, and injurious, but I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly in unbelief." He did not have the full picture, the full information, the full training. He stopped believing at the point that Christ was the Christ. These people are gone astray. They need to be corrected. And he was sticking to the old roots instead of looking forward to the new. And he did it ignorantly in unbelief. He received the good information and then went forward with it. What will he do when we gain that new information? When he gained that information on the road to Damascus, when all of a sudden he had the miraculous wake-up call, what will we do when we receive our wake-up call to new information? Do we evaluate it appropriately? Do we take and search the Scriptures daily whether these things were so? Another one is looking at the idea of the Bereans who searched the Scriptures. More noble were they than those of Thessalonica, for they searched the Scriptures daily, whether they were so. They weren't like the Pharisees trying to prove him wrong. They were verifying the new information they were receiving. Once we learn, what will we do with that information? Will we do as Saul did and He was changed over to Paul. I'm just thinking, if you were afraid of a man named Saul, Paul is not much of a changeover to make you feel the warm, fuzzy feelings. Kind of like Superman, he just wears a little pair of glasses and takes them off. He's got the same facial features, same haircut, hairdo, everything. There's a very little change there, but somehow it makes a world of difference. The difference wasn't really in his name changing. That was just a help, because when you heard Saul, you knew it. But the change was in his conscience changed. His heart changed. Will our conscience allow us to sit with sinners? Will we go out in this world and have a meal with a sinner? Will we go and step outside this door and fellowship with a sinner? Christ did when he came. Will we? As we look at the verses there, go look at it, and that was the same verse I believe I used last week about Matthew. After he had asked Matthew to follow me, he went and sat with tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees questioned him, why is he sitting with them? Doesn't he know they're sinners? Yes. What good is a physician? He doesn't tend to the healthy, he tends to those who need him. Will we take what we know? If we have the knowledge of the Bible, of the Scriptures, of Christ, of the good news, will we sit with those who don't have it and help them to receive it? And in all of this, will our conscience help us stay on the straight and narrow? There are two pathways we can choose, the straight and narrow or the wide and destructive, wide and broad. Which one will it allow us to stay on? Matthew 7:13 and 14 says, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many that go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Will we help others to find the narrow way? Will we take and check our conscience against the word of the Bible? What did the Bereans do? They checked the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. And as with, I hope, any preacher or any person that stands in the pulpit, I will say this now as well with this point. Don't take this lesson just because it's something I said. I believe I am correct in what I am saying. But search the Scriptures. Do we verify that and make sure that we are correct? Make sure that what we're being told is correct. Because have we believed misinformation, incomplete information, or even lies? And as a consequence are being led down the wrong path of belief like Jacob or Saul. Saul did not have the full piece of information. Jacob was just given a flat-out lie and believed it. What are we doing? Where are we going, and how is our conscience trained? Do we think about that? How is it that so many can believe so many different things in the world today? Do we take the time to verify it for ourselves? Do we take and seek that information? Hopefully we learn something new every day. We continue to learn and continue to grow. But what are those items that we're going to take in? Will it benefit us or will it hurt us? Something we need to evaluate, something we need to verify. The last song we sung was Let Him Have His Way With Thee. The question is, who is the him that we refer to in our daily lives? The song refers to Christ, refers to God having His way. That is the way it should be, for we should all be taught by God. Is that always the case? We also have the song of encouragement of when all of God's singers get home. We get to have the encouragement that good things will come. As we're studying in Revelation, we see that as well. We've seen a lot of issues that go on around about because people's consciences were not properly trained. And we also see that there will be glory in the end. Which pathway are we on today? Which one are we looking at in our lives? Do we need assistance in that? If you need to get onto the pathway of righteousness, then we encourage you to come to become a follower of Christ. Believe in what he has said. Be baptized into his service, into his blood, and live in his life. If we are already in his service, but our conscience is bothering us, it has been pricked because of something in our lives, then we also encourage that. If you come forward, we can pray with you, for you, and try and edify one another. If you have needs of the congregation, we ask that you come while together we stand and sing.